Before we begin tonight's story, if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I'll be your narrator tonight, so find a comfortable spot, put on your headphones, and let's begin. The old house groaned. It was a sound Elara had grown accustomed to over the past 6 months. A symphony of sighs and murmurs from ancient timber and settling foundations. Blackwood Manor was a creature of habit, its groans as predictable as the setting sun. There was the sharp crack of the western wall as it cooled in the evening, the low thrum of the water pipes in the dead of night, the whisper of wind through the eaves of the widow's walk that sounded almost like a woman weeping. Elara and her husband, Ben, had learned to map these sounds, to name them, to domesticate them into a comforting, familiar soundscape. It was the price of admission for a house with so much character, a sprawling Victorian relic they'd bought for a song, nestled on a generous plot of land just far enough from the city to feel like a permanent escape. But this groan was different. It came from the ground floor directly below their master bedroom. It wasn't the creak of wood contracting or the sigh of a floorboard settling. The sound had weight. It had purpose. It was the sound of a heavy footfall on the third step of the grand staircase, the one that always complained a high, reedy whine when stepped on just so. Elara knew its voice intimately. She'd made a game of it with 7-year-old Liam and 5-year-old Chloe, a game of who could avoid the squeaky step the longest. Her eyes snapped open in the velvet dark of the room. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed a serene, mocking 2:17 a.m. beside her. Ben was a mountain of stillness, his breathing a deep and even tide that spoke of untroubled sleep. The house was silent again. Had she dreamt it? It was possible. The stress of the move, the endless unpacking, the monumental task of turning this beautiful, decaying beast of a house into a home. It had worn her thin. She waited, her own breath caught in her throat, her ears straining against the oppressive quiet. For 1 minute, then 2, the only sound was the frantic thumping of her own heart against her ribs. Nothing. It must have been a dream, a particularly vivid one, perhaps, but a dream nonetheless. She was just starting to relax, to let the tension seep from her shoulders, when it came again. Creak. This time it was the floorboard at the top of the stairs, just outside their bedroom door. The one that Liam, in his dinosaur phase, had christened the T-Rex board because of its low, guttural growl. This was not a dream. Ice, sharp and immediate, flooded her veins. Every nerve ending fizzed with adrenaline. Someone was in the house. The thought was so stark, so brutally simple, it almost didn't feel real. It was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not to them, not in their sleepy, secluded corner of the world. Ben had installed a new security system, a state-of-the-art network of sensors and cameras they hadn't even fully learned how to use yet. It was supposed to be armed. Was it armed? She couldn't remember. In the chaotic tumble of dinner, bath time, and bedtime stories, had she forgotten to press the button? Her mind raced, a frantic slideshow of possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. A burglar expecting an empty house, a drifter seeking shelter from the encroaching autumn chill, or something worse. Her gaze darted around the darkened room, a space that had felt like a sanctuary moments before, now a potential trap. The tall, mullioned windows that overlooked the front lawn were just black mirrors, reflecting a distorted version of the room back at her. The shadows thrown by the hulking mahogany wardrobe seemed to stretch and deepen, no longer familiar shapes but crouching, formless threats. She had to wake Ben. That was the first, most logical step. A quiet shake, a whispered word. He was the pragmatist, the rock. He would know what to do, but a strange, paralyzing inertia held her fast. The sound had been so deliberate, so close. What if the person was right outside the door? What if the slightest sound from within the room, a rustle of sheets, a gasp of fear, was the very thing that triggered a violent confrontation? Her throat was tight, dry as dust. And where were the children? Liam and Chloe. Their rooms were at the other end of the long, L-shaped hallway. To get to them, you had to pass the top of the stairs. You had to pass the T-Rex board. A wave of nausea, cold and acidic, churned in her stomach. The thought of them, so small and utterly defenseless in their beds, was a physical blow. It dwarfed her own fear, replacing it with a primal, ferocious need to protect. Slowly, carefully, Elara eased herself out of bed. The floorboards were cold against her bare feet. She moved with a liquid grace she didn't know she possessed, each step a calculated risk, her body a tightly coiled spring of terror and resolve. The house remained silent. The intruder, whoever it was being just as quiet. Predator, listening, waiting. She crept to the bedroom door, her hand hovering over the heavy brass knob. She pressed her ear against the cool, painted wood. Nothing, just the faint, familiar hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen 2 floors below. Maybe they'd gone. Maybe they'd taken what they wanted and left. But what was there to take? They were still living out of boxes. The expensive electronics were still packed away. Her jewelry was in a safe deposit box. There was nothing of real value here, nothing worth the risk of breaking into an occupied house. The lack of logic was almost as frightening as the sounds themselves. She took a shallow, steadying breath and turned the knob. It was an old lock, and the bolt slid back with a soft, oily snick that sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. She pulled the heavy door inward, opening it just a crack, peering into the chasm of the hallway. The hall was a river of shadows, fed by a single tributary of moonlight from the large arched window at its far end. The pale light silvered the edges of the family photos lining the wall, portraits of smiling faces that seemed alien in this new, threatening context. Everything appeared to be in its place. The runner on the floor was straight. The small antique table against the wall was undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no looming figure. Relief, weak and trembling, began to wash over her. It had been her imagination, an overactive, sleep-deprived imagination playing tricks in an old, creaky house. She was about to retreat back into the safety of her room, to wake Ben and laugh nervously about her own foolishness, when her eyes fell on the gallery wall again. There was a photo of their family from last summer's trip to the coast. Ben, with his arm around her, Liam perched on his shoulders, Chloe making a silly face at the camera. It was Elara's favorite. It sat in a prominent position, the centerpiece of the collection. But it was wrong. The silver frame was hanging perfectly straight, but the photograph inside it had been turned around, so that its blank, white backing faced out into the hall. The air left Elara's lungs in a silent rush. This was not the house. This was not the wind. This was not her imagination. The blood roared in her ears, a deafening white noise that drowned out all other sound. The simple, deliberate act of turning that photograph was a message. Asterisk, I was here. I can get to you. I can touch the things you love. Asterisk, it was an act of violation more profound than any smashed window or stolen television. It was intimate. It was personal. It was a declaration of war. The fear was gone, burned away by a cold, sharp-edged fury. She didn't know who was in her house or why, but they had made a mistake. They had threatened her children. They had touched her family. And for that, there would be a reckoning. Clutching the doorframe for support, her knuckles white, Elara scanned the hallway again, her eyes now accustomed to the gloom. She peered down the long corridor toward the children's rooms. Their doors were closed. Were they safe? Or had he been in there, too? The thought sent a fresh spear of terror through her, but she forced it down. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She needed to be smart. She needed to be quiet. Her gaze drifted downwards, to the grand staircase that descended into the main foyer. From her vantage point, she could only see the first few steps leading down into the inky blackness of the ground floor. That was where the sound had come from. That was where he had been. Was he still down there, hiding in the cavernous living room, or the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves of books left by the previous owners? Or was he now somewhere else entirely, moving through the labyrinthine corridors of the old house with a quiet confidence that suggested he knew its layout better than she did? The security panel, she remembered with a jolt, was downstairs by the front door. If she could get to it, she could press the panic button. Police, sirens, safety. It was a straight shot down the stairs and across the foyer. but that would mean descending into the darkness, into the heart of the unknown territory where the threat lurked. It would mean crossing the very steps where she'd heard the phantom footfalls. Her phone. It was on the nightstand by the clock. A lifeline. She could slip back into the bedroom, grab it, lock the door, and call 911. It was the safest, most sensible option. But it would mean leaving the hallway unguarded. It would mean turning her back on the path to her children's rooms. An irrational but powerful instinct screamed at her not to cede one more inch of territory. This was her home. This was her family. She would not hide. She made a choice. Her objective was singular. Get to Liam and Chloe. Bring them back to the master bedroom, lock the door, and then call for help. It was a terrifying gauntlet to run. The hallway stretched before her like a haunted tunnel. Every shadow seemed to hold a breath. Every floorboard threatened a betrayal. But the image of that turned-over photograph was burned into her mind, a source of both terror and fuel. She took her first step out of the bedroom, her bare feet making no sound on the thick wool of the runner. One step, then another. She moved along the wall, her fingers trailing against the cool plaster, a blind woman navigating a familiar maze that had suddenly become hostile. Her senses were on fire. She could smell the faint, lingering scent of the lemon polish she'd used on the wood floors over the weekend. She could feel the subtle draft coming from under the arched window. She could hear the frantic, metronomic beat of her own pulse. She passed the T-Rex board, giving it a wide berth, her body contorting to avoid the slightest pressure. She was a ghost in her own home, an intruder in reverse. As she drew closer to Liam's room, she allowed herself a small, fragile sliver of hope. The door was still closed. A good sign. Please let him be okay. Please let them both be okay. She reached his door and paused, her ear pressed against the wood, just as she had done with her own. She heard the soft, rhythmic sigh of his breathing, occasionally punctuated by a little snuffling sound he always made in his sleep. He was alive. He was asleep. Relief so profound it almost buckled her knees surged through her. One down. Next was Chloe's room, just a few feet further down. Again she listened at the door. Silence. A deeper silence than from Liam's room. Elara's heart, which had just begun to slow, kicked back into a frantic rhythm. Chloe was a restless sleeper, always tossing and turning, mumbling in her dreams. The silence was unnatural. With a trembling hand, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing the soft, pale space of Chloe's bedroom. A night light shaped like a smiling crescent moon cast a gentle, golden glow from an outlet near the floor, illuminating a landscape of childhood dreams. Stuffed animals were piled in a corner, a fuzzy menagerie standing guard. A small table and chairs, set for a tea party that had presumably ended hours ago, sat expectantly in the center of the room. Moonlight streamed through the window, catching the glitter woven into the canopy above Chloe's bed. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked perfect, except for the silence. Elara's eyes were fixed on the bed. A small lump lay under the pale pink duvet, the familiar shape of her daughter curled up in sleep. The relief was so sudden and overwhelming that her legs felt like water. A shaky, half-formed laugh caught in her throat. She had been so consumed by fear, she was seeing monsters in every shadow. Chloe was a heavy sleeper, that's all. She must have been so deeply asleep she wasn't making her usual little noises. She took a step into the room, a profound sense of foolishness washing over her. She would just check, place a hand on her daughter's back to feel the rise and fall of her breath, and then retreat. She would wake Ben, and they would call the police, and this whole nightmare would be over. As she drew closer to the bed, however, the fragile relief began to crumble. The shape under the duvet was wrong. It was too still, too uniform. There was none of the organic irregularity of a sleeping child's body. It was just a lump. "Chloe?" she whispered, her voice a reedy thread of sound. No response. She reached the side of the bed, her hand trembling as she reached for the duvet. The fabric was cool to the touch. With a sharp, convulsive movement, she pulled it back. The bed was empty. The shape that had given her a moment of false hope was nothing more than 2 pillows and a stuffed bear, artfully arranged to mimic a sleeping child. Elara stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. It was a trick, a cruel, deliberate deception. He hadn't just taken her. He had staged this. He wanted her to have that moment of relief, only to snatch it away, to plunge her into a deeper, more refined level of terror. A strangled sound escaped her lips, a mix of a sob and a gasp. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for any sign of a struggle, any clue as to what had happened. The room was pristine. The tea set was undisturbed. The window was locked from the inside. There was nothing out of place. Nothing except her daughter, who had vanished from her own bed. She reached the side of the bed, her hand trembling as she reached for the duvet. The fabric was cool to the touch. With a sharp, convulsive movement, she pulled it back. The bed was empty. The shape that had given her a moment of false hope was nothing more than 2 pillows and a stuffed bear, artfully arranged to mimic a sleeping child. Elara stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. It was a trick, a cruel, deliberate deception. He hadn't just taken her. He had staged this. He wanted her to have that moment of relief, only to snatch it away, to plunge her into a deeper, more refined level of terror. A strangled sound escaped her lips, a mix of a sob and a gasp. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for any sign of a struggle, any clue as to what had happened. The room was pristine. The tea set was undisturbed. The window was locked from the inside. There was nothing out of place, nothing except her daughter, who had vanished from her own bed. Her gaze fell back to the empty space where Chloe should have been. Upon the pillow, stark against the white cotton of the case, lay a small object. It was a bird, no bigger than her thumb, carved from a dark, almost black wood. It was exquisitely detailed, each tiny feather etched with precision, its head cocked as if listening to a secret song. It was old. The wood was worn smooth in places, polished by the touch of countless hands. It did not belong here. They owned nothing like it. It was a token, a calling card. The cold fury from the hallway returned, magnified 1,000 times. It was a glacial rage that solidified her shaking limbs and clarified her panicked thoughts. This wasn't random. The turned photograph, the staged bed, the strange carved bird. These were the calculated moves of an opponent in a game she didn't understand. But she was learning the rules with terrifying speed. She snatched the bird from the pillow. It was heavy for its size, cool and solid in her palm. It felt like a piece of the house itself, ancient and dark. Holding it, she felt a bizarre certainty. Her daughter was still in the house. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. The man who had left this token hadn't taken Chloe away. He had simply moved her, hidden her somewhere within these walls. Why? The question screamed in her mind, but there was no answer. The logic of this intruder was alien and terrifying. He wasn't a thief. He was a puppeteer, and they were his marionettes. She had to get Ben. This was beyond her now. She couldn't do this alone. The plan had changed. It was no longer about getting the children to the master bedroom. It was about sounding the alarm, about bringing the full force of her husband's strength and pragmatism into this fight. It was about turning this from a solo ordeal into a united front. She turned to leave Chloe's room, the small wooden bird clutched tight in her fist, its sharp edges digging into her palm. As she stepped back into the hallway, a new, chilling thought occurred to her. The intruder had been in Chloe's room. He had been in the hallway. He had been on the stairs. He was moving through their home with impunity. What if he had gone back? Her blood ran cold. Liam. She had checked on him, yes. She had heard him breathing. But that was minutes ago. An eternity. She had left him alone. A sleeping lamb in a house with a wolf. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she raced back down the short stretch of hallway to Liam's door. She didn't bother listening this time. She threw the door open, her hand fumbling for the light switch. The overhead light flashed on, flooding the room in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Liam was in his bed, tangled in his blue comforter, but he was stirring, his brow furrowed as he began to wake from the sudden light. He was safe. He was there. But standing at the foot of his bed, a tall, slender silhouette against the window, was a man. He was dressed in dark clothing, his features obscured by the shadows and the glare of the light in Elara's eyes. He hadn't been there a moment ago. He was just there. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, watching Liam sleep. As the light flickered on, he didn't startle. He didn't run. He simply, slowly, raised his head and looked directly at Elara. She couldn't see his face, not clearly, but she could feel his gaze. It was not the wild, panicked look of a burglar caught in the act. It was calm. It was appraising. It was ancient. In that one terrifying moment, Elara understood. This man was not an intruder in the house. He was a part of it. For a frozen eternity, the only things that moved in the room were Liam's drowsy eyes, blinking against the light, and the dust motes dancing in the brilliant, sudden glare. The man was a statue carved from shadow. Elara's mind, which had been a frantic storm of thought, went utterly, terrifyingly still. It was the stillness of a predator that has cornered its prey and is deciding its next move. Her entire being was focused on that silent figure, a black hole in the fabric of the familiar, safe room. The wooden bird in her hand was a cold, hard reality check. This was happening. He was real. "Mommy!" Liam's voice was thick with sleep, a small, questioning sound that shattered the tableau. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his blue dinosaur pajamas rumpled, his hair a mess. "What's wrong? Who's that?" The man's head tilted further, a slow, unnatural motion like a branch bending under heavy snow. He didn't look at Liam. His gaze remained locked on Elara, a gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of her fury and fear to see the frantic, terrified mother underneath. And then he spoke. His voice was not what she expected. It wasn't a guttural threat or a harsh whisper. It was soft, melodic, with a strange, resonant quality, as if the sound were coming not just from his throat, but from the very walls of the room, from the floorboards beneath her feet. It was a voice that belonged to the house. "He sleeps so soundly," the man said, a statement of simple fact that carried an undercurrent of chilling intimacy. "He dreams of starships and ancient lizards. A loud mind, this one." Elara's breath hitched. How could he know that? Liam's two current obsessions. The casual, almost fond way he said it was more violating than any physical threat. He hadn't just been standing in her son's room. He had been listening to his dreams. The glacial rage she'd felt before now had a razor's edge. She took a single, deliberate step into the room, placing herself directly in the man's line of sight to the bed. Her body was a shield. "Where is she?" Elara's voice was a low growl, unrecognizable to her own ears. "Where is my daughter?" The man smiled. It was a faint, fleeting thing that did not touch his eyes, which remained two dark pools of shadow. "She is safe. The house is a deep sleeper, too. It holds its treasures close." He gestured vaguely with one long-fingered hand, a motion that encompassed the room, the hallway, the entire structure around them. "She is in the heart." The heart. The word hung in the air, nonsensical and yet filled with a dreadful weight. He spoke of the house as if it were a living creature, a vast, breathing organism that had swallowed her child. "I don't know who you are or what game you're playing," Elara said, forcing a steadiness into her voice she did not feel. "But it's over. Get out of my house." Her gaze fell back to the empty space where Chloe should have been. Upon the pillow, stark against the white cotton of the case, lay a small object. It was a bird, no bigger than her thumb, carved from a dark, almost black wood. It was exquisitely detailed, each tiny feather etched with precision, its head cocked as if listening to a secret song. It was old. The wood was worn smooth in places, polished by the touch of countless hands. It did not belong here. They owned nothing like it. It was a token, a calling card. The cold fury from the hallway returned, magnified 1,000 times. It was a glacial rage that solidified her shaking limbs and clarified her panicked thoughts. This wasn't random. The turned photograph, the staged bed, this strange, carved bird. These were the calculated moves of an opponent in a game she didn't understand. But she was learning the rules with terrifying speed. She snatched the bird from the pillow. It was heavy for its size, cool and solid in her palm. It felt like a piece of the house itself, ancient and dark. Holding it, she felt a bizarre certainty. Her daughter was still in the house. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. The man who had left this token hadn't taken Chloe away. He had simply moved her, hidden her somewhere within these walls. Why? The question screamed in her mind, but there was no answer. The logic of this intruder was alien and terrifying. He wasn't a thief. He was a puppeteer, and they were his marionettes. She had to get Ben. This was beyond her now. She couldn't do this alone. The plan had changed. It was no longer about getting the children to the master bedroom. It was about sounding the alarm, about bringing the full force of her husband's strength and pragmatism into this fight. It was about turning this from a solo ordeal into a united front. She turned to leave Chloe's room, the small wooden bird clutched tight in her fist, its sharp edges digging into her palm. As she stepped back into the hallway, a new, chilling thought occurred to her. The intruder had been in Chloe's room. He had been in the hallway. He had been on the stairs. He was moving through their home with impunity. What if he had gone back? Her blood ran cold. Liam. She had checked on him, yes. She had heard him breathing. But that was minutes ago. An eternity. She had left him alone. A sleeping lamb in a house with a wolf. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she raced back down the short stretch of hallway to Liam's door. She didn't bother listening this time. She threw the door open, her hand fumbling for the light switch. The overhead light flashed on, flooding the room in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Liam was in his bed, tangled in his blue comforter, but he was stirring, his brow furrowed as he began to wake from the sudden light. He was safe. He was there. But standing at the foot of his bed, a tall, slender silhouette against the window, was a man. He was dressed in dark clothing, his features obscured by the shadows and the glare of the light in Elara's eyes. He hadn't been there a moment ago. He was just there. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, watching Liam sleep. As the light flickered on, he didn't startle. He didn't run. He simply, slowly, raised his head and looked directly at Elara. She couldn't see his face, not clearly, but she could feel his gaze. It was not the wild, panicked look of a burglar caught in the act. It was calm. It was appraising. It was ancient. In that one terrifying moment, Elara understood. This man was not an intruder in the house. He was a part of it. For a frozen eternity, the only things that moved in the room were Liam's drowsy eyes, blinking against the light, and the dust motes dancing in the brilliant, sudden glare. The man was a statue carved from shadow. Elara's mind, which had been a frantic storm of thought, went utterly, terrifyingly still. It was the stillness of a predator that has cornered its prey and is deciding its next move. Her entire being was focused on that silent figure, a black hole in the fabric of the familiar, safe room. The wooden bird in her hand was a cold, hard reality check. This was happening. He was real. "Mommy!" Liam's voice was thick with sleep, a small, questioning sound that shattered the tableau. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his blue dinosaur pajamas rumpled, his hair a mess. "What's wrong? Who's that?" The man's head tilted further, a slow, unnatural motion like a branch bending under heavy snow. He didn't look at Liam. His gaze remained locked on Elara, a gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of her fury and fear to see the frantic, terrified mother underneath. And then he spoke. His voice was not what she expected. It wasn't a guttural threat or a harsh whisper. It was soft, melodic, with a strange, resonant quality, as if the sound were coming not just from his throat, but from the very walls of the room, from the floorboards beneath her feet. It was a voice that belonged to the house. "He sleeps so soundly," the man said, a statement of simple fact that carried an undercurrent of chilling intimacy. "He dreams of starships and ancient lizards. A loud mind, this one." Elara's breath hitched. How could he know that? Liam's two current obsessions. The casual, almost fond way he said it was more violating than any physical threat. He hadn't just been standing in her son's room. He had been listening to his dreams. The glacial rage she'd felt before now had a razor's edge. She took a single, deliberate step into the room, placing herself directly in the man's line of sight to the bed. Her body was a shield. "Where is she?" Elara's voice was a low growl, unrecognizable to her own ears. "Where is my daughter?" The man smiled. It was a faint, fleeting thing that did not touch his eyes, which remained two dark pools of shadow. "She is safe. The house is a deep sleeper, too. It holds its treasures close." He gestured vaguely with one long-fingered hand, a motion that encompassed the room, the hallway, the entire structure around them. "She is in the heart." The heart. The word hung in the air, nonsensical and yet filled with a dreadful weight. He spoke of the house as if it were a living creature, a vast, breathing organism that had swallowed her child. "I don't know who you are or what game you're playing," Elara said, forcing a steadiness into her voice she did not feel. "But it's over. Get out of my house." The man's smile faded. "Your house?" he repeated, the soft voice now tinged with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps pity. "A deed. Piece of paper. You think that makes it yours? You are guests here. Temporary. The house. The house is forever. And I am its memory." "Mommy, I'm scared," Liam whimpered from the bed. He was fully awake now, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on the stranger. That was it. The breaking point. The intellectual and psychological battle was over. This was about her son. "Liam," Elara said, her voice sharp, a commander's tone. She did not take her eyes off the man. "Get out of bed. Now, walk to me. Do not run." For a moment, Liam was frozen with fear. Then her command cut through the haze. He scrambled out from under the covers on the far side of the bed, his bare feet hitting the floor. The man watched, impassive. He made no move to stop him. He simply stood there, a sentinel of shadows, as Liam scurried around the bed and latched onto Elara's leg, burying his face in the fabric of her nightgown. She wrapped a protective arm around her son's shoulders, pulling him tight against her. She could feel his small body trembling. "You have what you want now," she said to the man, her voice low and tight. "You've terrorized my family. Now get out." "Terror was not my intent," he said, his voice once again a soft, reasonable murmur that was utterly at odds with the situation. "Understanding is my intent. The house chose you. It is curious. It has been so long since it felt a family inside it. It wishes to know you. All of you." He took a step forward out of the deepest shadow. Elara flinched, pulling Liam behind her, her hand tightening on the wooden bird until its sharp edges bit deep into her flesh. She could see him more clearly now. He was older than she'd first thought, yet ageless. His face was long and pale, his hair dark and streaked with gray at the temples. He wore a simple, dark work shirt and trousers, clothes that could have belonged to any century. He was unremarkable except for his eyes. They were dark and profoundly weary, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and slept too little. He looked, she thought with a sudden, bizarre clarity, like a curator of a museum that no one ever visited. "Stay back," she hissed. "My name is Arthur," he said, as if it were a peace offering. "I mean you no harm. I am merely the caretaker. The house has rules. It has needs. I enforce them. Give me back my daughter," Elara repeated, the words a mantra of her singular focus. Arthur shook his head slowly. "That is not for me to give. You must find her. You must learn the house's language. You must listen to what it's telling you. The girl is learning it now. She is a natural. It was a nightmare, a waking, breathing, talking nightmare. She had to get out of this room. She had to get to Ben. "We're leaving," she said, her voice flat and final. She began to back out of the room, pulling a shaking Liam with her. Each step was a monumental effort of will. She expected him to lunge, to block their path. But Arthur simply stood there, a portrait of unnerving patience. He watched them go, his expression unreadable. As she reached the doorway, he spoke one last time, his voice echoing in the brightly lit room. "The front door is not the only way out, Elara," he said. "And it is not the only way in." She didn't wait to hear more. She turned and fled down the hallway, half carrying, half dragging Liam with her. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. The hallway, which had been a terrifying gauntlet just minutes before, now felt like a path to salvation. She reached the master bedroom door, fumbled with the knob, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. She twisted the lock, the heavy thunk of the bolt a small, inadequate comfort. The room was as she'd left it. Ben was a still, silent lump under the covers, completely oblivious. The contrast was so jarring it felt like a physical blow. She had just faced down a monster, rescued her son, and learned her daughter was a prisoner of the house itself, and he had slept through it all. "Ben!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Ben, wake up! Wake up!" She shook his shoulder, a frantic, desperate motion. He stirred, grunting in his sleep. "Elara? What is it?" he mumbled, his voice thick and groggy. "There's someone in the house!" she cried, tears of terror and frustration finally starting to stream down her face. Liam was sobbing openly now, clinging to her for dear life. He was in Liam's room. "He has Chloe. He has Chloe." Ben sat bolt upright, suddenly wide awake, his eyes wild with alarm. What are you talking about? Call 911, Ben. Now!" He scrambled for his phone on the nightstand, his fingers jabbing at the screen. While he spoke in sharp, urgent tones to the dispatcher, Elara held Liam, rocking him, murmuring useless words of comfort. Her mind was a chaotic whirl. "Arthur, the heart of the house. You must learn its language." It was the ramblings of a madman. Yet he had been so calm, so certain. "They're on their way," Ben said, hanging up. He swung his legs out of bed, his face a mask of grim determination. He grabbed the heavy maglite he kept in the nightstand drawer. "Where is he? Is he still in Liam's room?" I don't know," she stammered. "He was just standing there. He let us go. Stay here. Lock this door. Don't open it for anyone but me," Ben commanded, his voice the one she knew, the voice of her rock, her pragmatist. "Ben, no. Don't go out there. He's not normal. You didn't see him." But Ben was already at the door, unlocking it. "I'm not letting some lunatic wander around my house, Elara. We have to find Chloe." He slipped out into the hallway, the beam of the flashlight cutting a sharp, white path through the darkness. Elara rushed to the door, peering out after him, her heart in her throat. She heard him move down the hall, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. She heard him throw open Liam's door. A moment of silence. Then Ben's voice, tight with confusion. "He's gone." He reappeared at her door a moment later, his face pale in the dim light of the hallway. "The room is empty, Elara. The window's locked. There's nowhere he could have gone." "He was there, Ben. I saw him. Liam saw him." She turned to her son. "Tell Daddy, honey. Tell him about the man." Liam just sobbed, unable to speak. Okay, Ben said, trying to soothe her, though his own eyes were darting nervously down the hall. "I believe you. We'll find Chloe." He moved past her, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls and floor as he headed for Chloe's room. "Let's check her room again. Maybe we missed something." Elara followed, dreading what he would find, or rather what he wouldn't. He pushed open the door to the moonlit, silent room. He swept the beam of the maglite across the space. The little tea set, the pile of stuffed animals, the empty, perfectly made bed. "She's gone," Ben whispered, his voice cracking. He rushed to the window, rattling the lock, then scanned the room again, his movements frantic. Elara stood in the doorway, her gaze falling back to the bed where the cruel deception had been staged. The pillows were still there, the stuffed bear, but something was different. On the pillow, next to the indent where the carved bird had been, lay another object. It was a single, tarnished brass key. It was old, ornate, and of a design she had never seen before. It hadn't been there a minute ago. Arthur was gone, but his presence lingered. He was still playing his game. He had left them another piece of the puzzle. The world outside the doorway, the flashing red and blue lights of approaching squad cars, the distant wail of sirens, seemed to belong to a different reality. Inside Chloe's room, there was only the suffocating quiet, the pale moonlight, and the impossible weight of the brass key in Ben's hand. He stared at it, turning it over and over. Where did this come from? His voice was a raw whisper, the pragmatist in him grappling with an event that defied all logic. It wasn't here before. I would have seen it. He left it, Elara said. Her own voice was eerily calm, a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea of panic. The initial shock was hardening into a strange, terrifying resolve. Arthur, he left it for us. It's the next part of the game. Ben looked at her, his face a mess of confusion and fear. Game? Elara, this isn't a game. A man, a kidnapper, was in our house. He took our daughter. Why would he leave a key? Because he's not a kidnapper, she said, the words feeling true even as they sounded insane. Not in the way we understand. He wants us to find her. He said so. You must learn the house's language. She clutched the wooden bird in her pocket. Its sharp form was a talisman, a connection to the unreality she was being forced to accept. The sirens grew louder, their piercing cry slicing through the night. Ben ran a hand through his hair, his knuckles white. The police are here. They'll find her. They'll set up a perimeter, bring in dogs. They'll find him. He was clinging to the procedural, the rational, the world of order and consequences. A sudden, sharp instinct seized Elara. She reached out and plucked the brass key from Ben's palm. Don't show them this, she said, her voice low and urgent. What? Why not? It's evidence. They won't understand, she insisted, her eyes wild. They'll think we're crazy. They'll think, I don't know what they'll think, but they won't listen. This is for us. He left it for us. Before Ben could protest, she slipped the key into the pocket of her nightgown, where it settled, cold and heavy, against the little wooden bird. The doorbell chimed, a shrill, incongruous sound in the charged atmosphere. Ben looked from Elara's determined face to the empty bed, then back again, a man caught between two irreconcilable nightmares. Finally, with a shuddering breath, he turned and went to let the real world in. Two uniformed officers stood on the porch, their faces grimly professional in the strobing emergency lights. The senior officer, a man in his 50s with a weary face and a name tag that read Harding, stepped inside. His younger partner, Riley, followed, his eyes sweeping the grand foyer, taking in the stacks of moving boxes and the imposing staircase. Mr. Davies? Harding asked, his voice a gravelly baritone that commanded attention. Yes, thank you for coming so quickly, Ben said, his own voice tight with strain. My daughter, Chloe, she's 5. She's been taken from her room. Harding's gaze flickered to Elara, who stood at the top of the stairs with Liam still clinging to her, his face buried in her side. He took in her disheveled state, her wide, haunted eyes. And you are Mrs. Davies? Elara, she said, her voice a thin thread. He was here, a man. He was in my son's room. He took my daughter. Okay, ma'am. Okay? Harding said, his tone carefully neutral, the voice of a man who had heard 1,000 frantic stories in the dead of night. Let's start from the beginning. Riley, you start a preliminary sweep. Check all points of entry, windows, basement, attic access. Standard procedure. As Riley began his methodical work, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous house, Harding turned his full attention to Ben and Elara. Ben, taking the lead, recounted the story as he knew it. He stuck to the facts, his voice clipped and efficient. He told of Elara waking him, of their discovery of Chloe's empty bed. He carefully omitted any mention of Arthur's name, the heart of the house, or the impossible appearance of the key. He was trying to build a case to present them with a crime they could solve. Harding listened, his expression unreadable, making notes in a small, spiral-bound pad. "And you didn't hear anything yourself, Mr. Davies?" "No," Ben admitted, his voice laced with self-reproach. "I was sound asleep." Harding's gaze shifted back to Elara. "Mrs. Davies, you said you saw the man?" Elara's heart pounded. She could feel the cold metal of the key pressing against her thigh. She saw the careful skepticism in the detective's eyes and knew, with a sinking certainty, that she had been right. He would not believe her, but what choice did she have? "Yes," she said. "He was in my son's room, standing at the foot of his bed." "Can you describe him?" "Tall, thin, dark hair, maybe some gray. He was wearing dark clothes. He talked to me." Harding's pen stopped moving. "He talked to you? What did he say?" Here it was, the precipice. She could lie, edit the story to make it more palatable, or she could tell the truth. She looked at Liam, who was trembling in her arms, a silent witness. She owed him the truth. He called himself Arthur. He said he was the caretaker of the house. He said the house wanted to know us. He said Chloe was in the heart of the house and that we had to find her. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out the small, dark bird. "He left this on her pillow." Harding stared at the wooden carving in her palm. He didn't take it. He just looked at it, then back at her face. The careful neutrality in his expression was hardening into something else. Professional pity. "Ma'am," he began, his voice softening in a way that felt more insulting than an accusation. The stress of moving, a new place, an old house with a lot of strange noises. It can play tricks on the mind. "I was not imagining it." Elara's voice rose, sharp with indignation. "My son saw him too. Liam, tell him. Tell the policeman about the man." Liam just burrowed deeper into her side, shaking his head, a muffled sob escaping him. "It's all right, son," Harding said gently. He looked back at Elara. Fear can be a powerful and confusing thing. Just then, Officer Riley returned, his face impassive. "No signs of forced entry, detective. Every window on the ground floor and second floor is locked from the inside, old-style sash locks, all secure. Same with the doors. I checked the cellar hatch from the outside. It's bolted shut and covered in cobwebs. Attic scuttle is locked from this side. There's no physical way anyone could have gotten in or out without breaking something or having a key." Harding nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Ben. "A key, you say?" Ben's face went pale. "We only have the one set from the realtor. I have them. Elara has hers." The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Asterisk, if no one broke in, how did the intruder get in? And how did he and the girl get out? Asterisk, the official, logical world of Detective Harding had no room for a man who could move through locked doors. His investigation was already hitting a wall, and his suspicions were beginning to coalesce around the only variable that made sense to him: the people inside the house. He separated them. He had Riley take Ben and Liam downstairs to the kitchen, while he asked Elara to walk him through Chloe's room again. The moment she was alone with him, the detective's demeanor shifted. The gentle condescension was replaced by a sharper, more focused questioning. "Mrs. Davies, are you and your husband having any problems?" "What? No." Elara was stunned. "Financial trouble? The house is a big undertaking. Sometimes the stress can be too much." "We are fine," she said, her voice cold. "A man took my daughter. A man who left a carved bird and talked about the heart of the house." Harding countered, his disbelief plain. "Have you ever experienced anything like this before? Sleepwalking? Vivid dreams you thought were real?" Every question was a subtle accusation, a gentle but firm attempt to reframe this nightmare as a product of her own fragile mind. He was trying to solve a puzzle, but he was looking at the wrong pieces. He saw a stressed, potentially unstable woman. He did not see the game board that Arthur had laid out. Frustration and despair warred within her. She felt trapped, not just by the house, but by the rigid logic of the world outside it. They were alone, utterly and completely alone in this. Downstairs, Ben was facing a similar, though more subtle, interrogation. Riley, the younger officer, was more conversational, asking about their jobs, how they liked the town, where they'd moved from. But the questions all circled the same drain. How well did he and Elara really know each other? Had she been acting strangely lately? Was there anyone who might want to harm their family? Ben answered as best he could, the foundations of his orderly world cracking with every denial. He knew Elara wasn't unstable. He knew she hadn't harmed Chloe, which meant she was telling the truth, which meant there was a man named Arthur who could walk through walls and talk to houses. It was a thought so monstrous his mind refused to fully embrace it. An hour later, the two officers convened in the foyer. The sun was not yet up, but a pale, gray light had begun to filter through the windows, making the shadows in the house seem deeper and darker. "Okay," Harding said, addressing both Ben and Elara. "We're going to treat this as a high-priority missing person case. We'll get an alert out, start a grid search of the surrounding woods as soon as the sun is up. But I need to be frank with you. The absence of any physical evidence of a break-in is problematic." He looked from Ben's desperate face to Elara's defiant one. "We'll be in touch. Don't leave the property." With that, they were gone. The front door clicked shut, leaving Ben and Elara standing in the vast, silent foyer. The flashing lights vanished, and the wail of the sirens faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than before. The brief intrusion of the outside world had only served to amplify their isolation. "They don't believe me," Elara said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. Ben didn't answer right away. He walked over to the grand staircase and sank onto the bottom step, burying his face in his hands. "They think," he started, then stopped. He couldn't say it. "They think I did something," Elara finished for him, "or that we're lying to cover something up." She felt a strange detachment, a clarity born of pure desperation. The police were a dead end. They were playing the wrong game. She walked over to him, her hand going to the pocket of her nightgown. She pulled out the ornate brass key. It gleamed dully in the pre-dawn light. "They're gone, Ben," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's just us now. Him and us." Ben looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He stared at the key in her hand. For the first time, a flicker of something beyond panicked denial entered his expression. He was a man of logic, and logic had failed him. His wife's impossible story was all he had left. "The heart of the house," he murmured, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "What does that even mean?" "I don't know," Elara said, her gaze sweeping up the grand staircase, past the gallery wall with its one-turned photograph, into the shadowy depths of the home they had bought. "But I think this is how we find out." The key felt like a promise and a threat. It was Arthur's move. Now it was theirs. The key was their only tangible link to Arthur's alien logic. While Liam, exhausted by terror, finally slept fitfully on the master bedroom's chaise lounge, Ben and Elara sat at the massive oak dining table, a relic left by the previous owners. The sun was fully up now, casting long, dusty fingers of light across the room, illuminating a tableau of domestic horror. A half-empty box of cereal sat next to a stack of unpaid bills. A child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator, and in the center of the table, between two untouched mugs of coffee, lay the brass key. It was a thing of strange beauty. The head was fashioned into an intricate knot of what looked like stylized branches or roots, coiling in on themselves. The shaft was smooth, but the bit was a complex series of teeth and notches unlike any modern lock. It was a key from another time, for a door they had never seen. "We have to search the house," Ben said, breaking the long silence. He was in motion now, pacing the length of the dining room. The helplessness of waiting for the police had been torture. Action, any action, was a bomb. Every room, every closet, every crawl space. "She has to be here." He said she was here. He was talking himself into it, trying to bridge the gap between the rational world he knew and the nightmare they were living. "He didn't say she was in a room, Ben," Elara corrected gently, her gaze fixed on the key. "He said she was in the heart." "It's a metaphor, Elara. He's a psychopath. He's playing with us. He's hidden her somewhere." The cellar? The attic. The police checked, she reminded him. Riley said the attic scuttle was locked from our side. The cellar hatch bolted from the outside. Maybe they missed something. A loose board, a hidden panel. This house is 150 years old. It's full of secrets. He was grasping at straws, but they were the only straws he had. Elara picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. This is the secret, she said. He didn't leave this for us by accident. This opens something. A door, a chest, a box. Something the police wouldn't know to look for. They began a systematic, frantic search. Their initial plan was to test the key on every lock in the house. They started on the ground floor, jamming the key into the ornate keyholes of the library doors, the study, the parlor. Fit none of them. They moved to the second floor, trying bedroom doors, linen closets, even the small, mysterious door set high on the wall of the master bathroom that they assumed led to some ancient plumbing access. Nothing. The key was a stubborn, silent enigma. Their search grew more desperate. Ben, driven by a need for physical exertion, began tapping on walls, listening for hollow sounds. He pulled up the corners of old rugs, searching for hidden floor hatches. He ran his hands along the endless shelves of books in the library, feeling for a false volume that might trigger a hidden mechanism. It was the stuff of Gothic novels, a descent into cliché that felt utterly, terrifyingly real. Elara, meanwhile, found herself drawn to the details Arthur had manipulated. She stood for a long time before the gallery wall in the upstairs hall, staring at the turned-over photograph. She carefully took it down. The photo inside was unharmed, a frozen moment of happiness that seemed to mock her. She studied the frame, the backing, the wall behind it. There was nothing. It was just a picture hook. But the act itself, it was a signpost. Arthur had touched this. He had been here. He was directing their attention. Her search became less about finding locks and more about finding Arthur's fingerprints on their world. She walked through the rooms not as a homeowner, but as an archaeologist, looking for anomalies. In the parlor, a room they barely used, she noticed a faint circle on the dusty floor where a small table must have stood for years. But the table wasn't there. It had been moved. She found it in a far corner, pushed against the wall as if an afterthought. Why? Was it random, or was it another piece of the puzzle? It was in the library that she found the next breadcrumb. The room was Ben's favorite, a magnificent, two-story space lined with dark wood and filled with thousands of books left by the Blackwood family, the original owners. While Ben was in the adjoining study, checking the fireplace flue for any hidden levers, Elara ran her fingers along the spines of the leather-bound volumes. They were mostly classics, histories, collections of poetry. Her fingers stopped on a slim volume of local history, bound in worn green leather. A history of Blackwood County and its environs. It was just like all the others, but something made her pull it from the shelf. As she did, she felt a subtle resistance, and then a faint click from deep within the wall. "Ben!" she called out, her voice sharp with adrenaline. He was at her side in an instant. "What is it? Did you find something?" She pointed at the empty space on the shelf. "When I took this book out, I heard something. A click, like a lock disengaging." Together, they stared at the shelf. Ben pushed on the back panel. Nothing. He ran his hands along the adjoining shelves. Nothing. He took the book from Elara and tried to put it back, to see if he could replicate the sound. It slid back into place without a sound. "Maybe it was just the house settling," he said, his voice edged with disappointment. "No," Elara insisted. "It was a sound, a mechanical sound." She looked at the book in his hand, then back at the wall of books surrounding them. It was a forest of paper and leather, a needle in a haystack. "He's making us look," she whispered. "He wants us to learn. He wants us to read." She opened the local history book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded. She flipped through chapters on agricultural development and town founders until a name jumped out at her. Blackwood, the family that built the manor. She began to read, scanning the dense text for anything that might be a clue. The history was dry, detailing generations of Blackwoods who had been prominent citizens, landowners, and businessmen. Then she came to a small, almost parenthetical section near the end of the family's entry. It mentioned a lesser-known Blackwood, an eccentric son from the late 19th century, a man who had been a gifted architect and woodcarver, but who grew reclusive in his later years. He was said to have spent the last decade of his life making endless, secret modifications to the family home, building hidden passages and trick rooms, turning the manor into his own private labyrinth. His name was Arthur Blackwood. Elara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Ben, look." She showed him the passage. He read it, his face growing pale. "Arthur," he breathed. "The caretaker." "He's not a caretaker, Ben," Elara said, a terrifying understanding dawning. "He's a ghost, or something like one. He's tied to this house. He is the house." The man in Liam's room was not some drifter who had learned the manor's secrets. He was the man who had built them. A cold dread settled over them, deeper and more profound than the fear of a simple home invasion. They were not fighting a man. They were fighting the architect of their prison, a spirit who knew every secret corner, every hidden mechanism, because he had put them there himself. Ben sank into a leather armchair, the book hanging limply from his hand. "This is impossible," he whispered. "People don't just haunt houses, don't they?" Elara asked. Her mind was racing, connecting the dots. The strange groans of the house she had learned to ignore. Were they just settling timbers, or were they something more? The feeling she sometimes had of being watched, even when she was alone. Was it just new house jitters, or was it Arthur's unseen presence? "The key," she said suddenly, pulling it from her pocket. "It's his key. It doesn't open a normal door. It opens one of his doors." Inspired by this new, terrifying context, their search took on a new dimension. They were no longer looking for signs of a break-in. They were looking for signs of Arthur Blackwood's architecture. They looked for seams in the woodwork that weren't quite right, for sections of wallpaper that didn't perfectly match, for floorboards that were a slightly different shade than their neighbors. It was Ben who found it. He was back in the parlor, staring at the spot where the small table had been moved from. His eyes traced the circle in the dust, then followed the path to where the table now stood. He looked at the wall behind it. It was covered in a heavy, brocaded wallpaper, a pattern of swirling vines and flowers. It was seamless, perfect, but as he stared, he noticed something. Within the intricate pattern, almost perfectly disguised, was the faint outline of a keyhole. It was small, no bigger than his thumbnail, and set into what looked like a carved wooden flower. "Elara," he called, his voice tight. She rushed in. He pointed. Her eyes widened as she saw it. It was a lock hidden in plain sight, a piece of camouflage so brilliant they never would have found it if they hadn't known to look. With a trembling hand, Elara took the brass key. The ornate, root-like head seemed to mimic the floral pattern on the wall. She inserted the key into the hidden lock. It slid in perfectly. She looked at Ben, her heart hammering. He nodded, his face grim. She took a deep breath and turned the key. There was no loud click or groan. Instead, a deep, resonant thrum vibrated through the floor, a sound like a giant sigh. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a section of the wall, a panel about 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, swung silently inward, revealing not a closet or a crawl space, but a dark, narrow passageway. A gust of cool, stale air, smelling of dust and damp earth and something else, something faintly sweet like decaying flowers, washed over them. The passage was unlit, a maw of absolute blackness leading into the unknown spaces of the house, into Arthur's domain, into the heart. The darkness within the passageway was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical presence. It seemed to drink the light from the parlor, to deaden the sound. Ben shone his mag light into the opening, but the powerful beam seemed to be swallowed after only a few feet, illuminating a short stretch of rough stone walls and then nothing, as if the darkness beyond were a solid thing. "Chloe!" Ben called into the passage, his voice tight and strained. It was a father's desperate, instinctual cry. The only answer was the echo of his own voice, which came back strangely muted, as if the passage were lined with velvet. Liam, who had been a silent, terrified shadow at Elara's side since she'd retrieved him from the bedroom, let out a small whimper and pressed his face into her leg. She stroked his hair, her own fear a cold, heavy knot in her stomach. This was it, the threshold. Arthur had given them the key, and they had found the lock. He had invited them into his world. It was a test, a trap, a rescue mission. It was all of those things at once. "I'm going in," Ben said, his jaw set. He was holding the mag light like a weapon, the heavy metal tube a flimsy shield against the supernatural dread that filled the air. "No, Ben, wait," Elara said, grabbing his arm. "We can't just run in there. We don't know what it is, where it goes. This is his territory. He made it. He controls it. So what are we supposed to do, Elara? Sit here and wait for him to send us another riddle? Chloe is in there." His voice cracked on their daughter's name, the raw pain momentarily overriding the fear. "I know," she said softly, "but he's playing a game. We have to play it too or we'll lose. We have to be smart." She thought back to everything that had happened. The turned photograph, the carved bird, the staged bed, the key, the book. Each one was a deliberate, calculated move. Arthur wasn't a monster of chaos. He was a creature of intricate design. There had to be a logic to this, even if it was a madman's logic. "He called himself the house's memory," she mused, her gaze lost in the oppressive darkness of the passage. "The book said he spent his last years building these modifications. What if these passages aren't just empty tunnels? What if there's something else? They're a way to get around the house without being seen," Ben said, sticking to the most practical explanation. "A way for him to spy on us, to get to the kids' rooms." "Yes," Elara agreed, "but it feels like more than that." Her eyes fell on the book they had left on the library table, A History of Blackwood County. He led us to that book for a reason, not just to learn his name. There must be more. Leaving Ben to stand guard at the gaping hole in their reality, Elara went back into the library, Liam trailing her like a small, frightened moon. She snatched the book and brought it back to the parlor, laying it open on the floor in the light from the doorway. She scanned the pages again, this time not just for Arthur's name, but for any mention of the house itself, any architectural details, any local legends. Her eyes caught on a footnote she'd missed before, connected to the passage about Arthur Blackwood's reclusive final years. It was a citation, referencing the personal journals of Arthur Blackwood, which were, the note said, in the possession of the Blackwood County Historical Society. "His journals," she whispered. It was another dead end. They couldn't just leave, drive to the Historical Society, and ask to see the private journals of a madman who was currently holding their daughter captive. But as her gaze drifted from the footnote, she noticed something else. Tucked into the book's spine, almost completely hidden in the gutter between the pages, was a thin, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was not a part of the original binding. It had been added later. Her fingers trembled as she carefully worked it free. It was a small, hand-drawn map, or rather, a fragment of one. The ink was faded, the lines drawn with a draftsman's precise hand. It showed a series of interconnected squares and rectangles labeled with familiar names. Asterisk parlor, library, dining hall. Asterisk, and weaving between them, a network of thin, double-lined corridors, marked with symbols she didn't recognize. In the corner of the fragment, drawn with the same meticulous care, was a small sketch of the wooden bird she had found on Chloe's pillow. Next to it was a single word, "Listen." "Ben," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned from the passageway, his face etched with worry. She held out the map fragment. "Look." He took it, his eyes widening as he recognized the layout of their own home, overlaid with this secret geography. "Secret passages," he breathed. "He made a map. He left it for us in the book." "It's not the whole house," Elara pointed out, tracing the lines with her finger. "It's just a piece. This section of the ground floor." She looked at the bird symbol. "Asterisk, listen, asterisk," she read. What does that mean? Her mind went back to Arthur's words in Liam's room. The house is a deep sleeper. You must listen to what it's telling you. And before that, the first groan she'd heard, the sound of the squeaky step on the staircase. The house had a voice. She had just never truly listened to it. The bird, she said, a sudden wild idea forming. She pulled the small wooden carving from her pocket. Felt cool and smooth in her hand. On a hunch, she held it up to her ear, just as the drawing seemed to suggest. For a moment, there was nothing. Then she heard it. Faintly, so faintly she thought she was imagining it. A sound seemed to emanate from the wood itself. It wasn't a voice. It was a low, rhythmic hum, a vibration that tingled against her ear. It was a pure single note. What is it? Ben asked, watching her. It's humming, she said, bewildered. The bird is humming. She held it out to him. He pressed it to his ear, his brow furrowed in concentration. I hear it, he said after a moment, his voice filled with awe and terror. It's a frequency, a resonance. They stood in silence for a moment, two modern people holding a piece of impossible ancient technology, a key to a world that shouldn't exist. The house has a language, Elara whispered, finally understanding. And it's not words, the sound, vibrations. He's not just a ghost, Ben. He was an architect, a woodcarver. Maybe he was something else, too. A physicist, an acoustician. The idea was insane, but it fit the bizarre evidence. Arthur Blackwood hadn't just built passages. He had imbued the house and the objects within it with a kind of resonant life. He had tuned it like a giant, complex instrument. The humming from the bird was constant, a low, steady drone. Elara held it up again, turning slowly. The note didn't change. It wasn't pointing them in a direction. It was just on. What do we do? Ben asked, his gaze shifting back to the dark passage. Do we go in? We listen, Elara said. She took the mag light from him. Give me a minute. Before he could protest, she took a deep breath and stepped over the threshold, into the oppressive blackness of Arthur's world. The air was immediately colder, the smell of damp earth and decay more pronounced. The light from the parlor behind her seemed to vanish, cut off as if by a curtain. She was in a narrow tunnel, the walls rough-hewn stone on one side, and dark, ancient planking on the other, the back of the house's normal walls. She swept the flashlight beam ahead. The passage went forward about 10 feet, then turned sharply to the left, following the shape of the library. It was claustrophobically narrow, the ceiling low. She held the bird to her ear again. The humming was the same, steady, unchanging. She took a few steps forward, her footsteps unervingly loud on the stone floor. She stopped and listened again. This time, she heard something else. Overlaid with the bird's steady hum was another sound, a different note, higher pitched and intermittent like a faint, pulsing signal. It was coming from the darkness ahead. Listen, it wasn't just a command, it was an instruction. The bird was the receiver, and the house was the transmitter. She turned back to the opening, her face a pale oval in the gloom. There's another sound in here, she called out to Ben. A different one. The bird lets me hear it. She handed the carving to Ben, who had followed her to the edge of the passage. He stepped inside, his big frame seeming to fill the narrow space. He held the bird to his ear. His eyes widened. I hear it too. It's like a beacon. He swept the flashlight beam down the corridor, in the direction of the pulsing sound. The light died in the distance. Chloe, he breathed. It has to be her. He's put something with her, another one of these things. It's leading us to her. He shook his head, tears welling up. Don't go. The monster man is in there. He is, Elara said, kneeling down to look him in the eye. But we are going to get your sister back from him. We are stronger than he is. Do you understand? He nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. I'm leaving the door open, Ben said, his voice firm with a newfound purpose. We'll have the light from the parlor. We won't go so far that we can't see it. And we'll shout to you, Liam. We'll be right here. It was a flimsy promise, but it was all they had. Leaving their son sitting in the relative safety of the lit parlor, a small, lonely soldier guarding the portal, Ben and Elara turned to face the passage together. Ben held the flashlight, cutting a path through the gloom. Elara held the bird, their arcane compass, pressed to her ear, listening for the faint, pulsing heartbeat of the house. They moved forward into the suffocating dark, following a sound that only they could hear, a melody of wood and stone and madness, leading them deeper into the heart of Blackwood Manor. The passage was a gullet swallowing them whole. The air, thick with the scent of damp stone and something vaguely metallic like old blood or rust, grew colder with every step. The only light was the bobbing, nervous circle of the maglite beam in Ben's hand. It danced across the rough textures of the tunnel. Ancient, moss-dusted support beams on their right, and the raw, jagged stone of the house's deep foundations on their left. The world of the parlor, with its warm lamplight and familiar furniture, seemed a universe away, visible only as a dim, reassuring rectangle of light far behind them. Elara held the bird to her ear, the cold with a strange comfort. The low, constant hum was the baseline, the carrier wave of the house's secret life. The other sound, the pulsing, higher-pitched note, Chloe's beacon, was faint but clear, drawing them forward into the oppressive dark. "It's getting stronger," she whispered, her voice sounding small and thin in the enclosed space. "The pulsing. We're going the right way." Ben grunted in response, his knuckles white where he gripped the flashlight. He was a man of action, a man who fixed leaky faucets and built treehouses. This subterranean world of acoustic ghosts and secret passages was an assault on his very nature. But the thought of Chloe at the end of this path was a powerful engine. He pushed forward, his shoulders brushing the stone walls. They followed the passage as it snaked through the house's hidden anatomy. It sloped gently downward, the floor changing from rough-laid stone to hard-packed earth. They could hear the sounds of the house from a new perspective. The familiar groans and sighs were louder here, closer. They could hear the gurgle of water in pipes they didn't know existed, the low thrum of the furnace in the cellar, a sound that from this vantage point felt less like a machine and more like the respiration of a sleeping beast. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 50 feet, the passage opened into a small, junction-like space, a rough-hewn chamber no larger than a closet. Two identical, dark openings branched off from it, one leading to the left, the other to the right, both consumed by impenetrable blackness, a fork in the road. "Okay," Ben said, his voice tight. He swept the flashlight into the left-hand tunnel, then the right. They looked exactly the same. "Which way?" Elara pressed the bird harder against her ear, closing her eyes to concentrate. She turned slowly, aiming her ear like a directional antenna. The low, steady hum of the house was constant, as always. But the pulsing beacon, the sound that was their only hope, had become confusing. It was no longer coming from a single point ahead of them. It was coming from both directions at once. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the small chamber, creating a disorienting, confusing signal. "I can't tell," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "It sounds like it's coming from everywhere. The echo in here is scrambling it." "Damn it," Ben breathed, the word a plume of white vapor in the cold air. He ran his free hand over his face. "A trick. He's trying to slow us down, to confuse us." He stepped into the left-hand passage, holding the light ahead. "Let's try this way. It's a 50-50 shot." "Wait," Elara said, her eyes scanning the small chamber. Arthur wasn't a creature of chance. Everything he did had a purpose, a design. A 50-50 guess felt wrong. It wasn't his style. Her gaze fell upon a small alcove carved into the rock wall of the chamber, something she hadn't noticed at first. It was at waist height, partially obscured by a protruding stone. Inside the alcove sat a small, leather-bound satchel, cracked and gray with age and mildew. It looked like it had been sitting there for a century. With a sense of both dread and anticipation, Elara reached in and lifted the satchel out. The leather was stiff and cold. She fumbled with the rusted buckle, which crumbled in her fingers. Inside was not another key or a carving, but a stack of loose papers, filled with the same meticulous, spidery handwriting as the map fragment. It was a section of Arthur Blackwood's journal. "Ben, look," she said, holding a page up to the flashlight beam. "It's from him." Together, they huddled in the cramped chamber, the flashlight balanced on a rock, and began to read the mad scripture of the man who had built their prison. October 12, 1888. *, the new wing is complete, but the dissonance is worse than ever. Father calls it my folly, this endless construction. He sees only wood and stone. He does not hear the song. He moves through these halls, and his very presence is a cacophony, a shouting that disrupts the house's delicate harmony. The servants, the guests, their laughter, their arguments, their clumsy, noisy lives. They are a plague of static. They do not understand that the house is an instrument, a vast resonator I have spent my life attempting to tune. *, 4 years, I have heard its true voice, a low, perfect hum in the deep places, in the stones of the foundation and the heartwood of the ancient beams. A pure tone, a sound of peace. But the living are a discordant symphony. Their heartbeats, their breathing, their chaotic thoughts, they create interference patterns, ugly vibrations that cause the house pain. It groans under the strain of their existence. *, I have built the passages not to hide, but to listen, to find the nodes, the quiet points where the house's voice is purest. I have worked with the wood, carving the resonance into it, creating talismans that can amplify the true song and filter out the noise of life. The birds, they are my stethoscopes. They allow me to hear the house's heart. *, but it is not enough. The noise always seeps back in. I have come to a new conclusion, a terrifying and beautiful one. The house does not need to be shielded from life. It needs to absorb it, to harmonize with it. A new life, a young life, one that has not yet been deafened by the world's clamor, could be tuned to the house's frequency. A child's mind, so fluid and open, could learn the song. They would not be a source of static, but a new chord in the symphony, a permanent resident, a voice to sing with the house, forever. *, the girl they have brought to visit, little Eleanor, with her quiet games and humming songs. She has potential. Her resonance is almost clear. I could teach her. I could bring her into the heart, the central chamber where the primary resonance is strongest. She would not be lost. She would be found. She would be part of the eternal music, a gift to the house, a final, perfect tuning. *, the page ended there. Elara's hand was shaking so hard she could barely hold it steady. She looked at Ben. His face was ashen. The words confirmed their worst fears and introduced new, unimaginable ones. Arthur wasn't a malevolent ghost in the traditional sense. He was a deranged artist, a mad conductor, and he saw their family not as victims to be tormented, but as instruments to be used. He wasn't trying to kill Chloe. He was trying to absorb her, to make her a permanent, living part of the house's symphony. The last paragraph sent a spear of ice through Elara's heart. Little Eleanor. The previous owners, the ones who had sold them the house, were an elderly couple named Schmidt. But before them, for decades, the house had been owned by the estate of a woman who had died there in her 90s. A recluse. Elara remembered the realtor mentioning her name in passing. Eleanor Blackwood, Arthur's niece. Had he done this before? Had he tried to tune his own niece? "He's a monster," Ben whispered, the words catching in his throat. "He thinks he's saving her. He's trying to turn Chloe into a ghost." The revelation was sickening, but it also provided a sliver of clarity. "This isn't about us, Ben," Elara said, her mind racing. "It's about him, his obsession, his work. He's reenacting something." She looked at the two dark tunnels. "This is a test. He doesn't want it to be easy." The journal entry. It's a clue to the choice. They reread the last few sentences. The heart, the central chamber where the primary resonance is strongest. "Primary resonance," Ben repeated, grabbing the bird from Elara. He went to the mouth of the left-hand tunnel and held the bird to his ear. Then he crossed to the right-hand tunnel and did the same. He stood still for a full minute, his eyes closed. "There," he said, pointing to the right. The constant hum, the house's sound. It's almost imperceptibly louder in that direction. The pulsing beacon for Chloe is the same from both, but the background note, the true song he wrote about, it's stronger on the right. That has to be the way to the central chamber. It was a leap of faith based on the writings of a madman, but it was all they had. Back in the parlor, Liam sat huddled on the floor, his arms wrapped around his knees. The rectangle of light from the hidden doorway was his only comfort in the vast, shadowy room. He could hear his parents' muffled voices echoing from inside the wall, a distant, reassuring murmur. He kept his eyes fixed on the opening, waiting for them to come back with Chloe. Then, with a low, deep groan of old wood, the heavy panel of the secret door began to swing shut. "No!" he cried out, scrambling to his feet, but it moved with a slow, inexorable force, as if pushed by an unseen, powerful hand. With a solid thump, it settled back into the wall, sealing his parents inside. The keyhole, a tiny dark flower in the wallpaper, stared back at him. The parlor was plunged into a deeper gloom, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Liam was alone. He ran to the wall, his small fists beating against the seamless wallpaper. "Mommy! Daddy!" he screamed, his voice thin and reedy in the sudden, crushing silence. There was no answer. The wall was solid. The house had swallowed them. Tears streamed down his face. He backed away from the wall, his eyes darting around the room. The familiar shapes of the furniture, the sofa, the armchairs, the grand piano in the corner, seemed to shift and warp in the shadows, taking on monstrous forms. The silence was the worst part, pressed in on him, heavy and watchful. Then, a small sound from across the room. Click. Liam froze, his terrified gaze snapping toward the gallery wall in the hallway, visible from the parlor doorway. The single, turned-over photograph, the one with its back facing out, slowly, impossibly began to turn. With a faint, dry scrape, it rotated in its frame until the smiling faces of his family were visible once more. It righted itself, as if a spectral hand had adjusted it. The house was watching him, and it was starting to play. Panic gave way to a child's primal terror. Liam backed away from the restored photograph, his small heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The house was a living thing, and it was playing with him, a cat with a mouse. The silence that followed the photograph's impossible turn was even more menacing than the sound had been. He was alone, his parents trapped, his sister gone, and the monster was everywhere at once. He bolted. His bare feet slapped against the cold wood floors as he fled the parlor, driven by the pure instinct to find a safe, small space. He ran past the grand staircase that led up to his bedroom. That was out of the question. That was where the man had been, and down a short hall toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen. The kitchen felt safer. It was his mother's domain, a place of warmth, the scent of baking cookies, and the familiar hum of the refrigerator. He burst through the swinging door into the vast, dark kitchen. Moonlight streamed through the large window over the sink, painting the stainless steel appliances and white countertops in an eerie, ghostly light. For a moment, it was just a kitchen. He could breathe. He scrambled under the heavy farmhouse table, pulling his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible. In the enclosed, dark space, with the solid wood above and around him, he felt a fragile sense of security. He was hidden. He sat there, shivering, listening to the sounds of the house. The rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the kitchen faucet. The low groan of the refrigerator cycling on. The wind whistling in the chimney. Were they normal sounds? Or were they Arthur's voice, whispering to him? The journal entry his parents had read aloud echoed in his mind. Words he hadn't fully understood, but whose terrifying gist had seeped into him. A new life, a young life, could learn the song. He didn't want to learn the song. He just wanted his mom and dad. From his hiding place, he had a clear view of the kitchen floor. His eyes, now fully accustomed to the dark, scanned the black and white checkerboard tiles. He was tracing the pattern with his gaze when he noticed it. On the other side of the kitchen, near the back door that led out to the garden, a single black tile was out of place. It wasn't crooked or raised, but it was a different shade. While the other black tiles were a deep, matte black, this one had a faint, almost greasy sheen to it, as if it had been recently cleaned or handled. Curiosity, a powerful force even in the face of terror, began to war with his fear. He remembered his father, earlier, tapping on walls and pulling up rugs, looking for secrets. This was a secret. He knew it. Slowly, cautiously, he crawled out from under the table. He moved across the cold floor like a little commando, staying low, his eyes fixed on the strange tile. He reached it and touched it. The surface was smooth and cool, just like the others. He tried to press on it, to wiggle it. It was solid, unmoving. Disappointment washed over him. Maybe it was just a strange tile. Maybe he was imagining things. He was about to retreat to the safety of the table when his fingers, tracing the grout line around the tile, felt a small, almost imperceptible notch along one edge. It was a tiny indentation, just big enough for a fingernail. With a surge of adrenaline, he dug his nail into the notch and pried upwards. There was a faint sucking sound, and the tile lifted. It wasn't a tile at all. It was a lid, a thin piece of slate cut to look like a tile. Beneath it was a dark, square hole, and nestled inside on a bed of what looked like faded red velvet was a single object. It was a silver whistle. It was small, tarnished with age, and attached to a delicate silver chain. It was simple, elegant, and looked very, very old. It was another one of the house's treasures, another one of Arthur's toys. Liam hesitated. His parents had found a bird that made a sound you could only hear with your ear pressed to it. This was an instrument meant to be played, to make a sound for everyone to hear. The word from his parents' map fragment echoed in his head. Listen. Was this how he could listen? Or was this how he could talk back? A new thought, bold and terrifying, entered his mind. What if he could use this against the house? What if he could make a sound that Arthur didn't like? A discordant symphony, as the journal had called it. What if he could be the noise? His small hands trembled as he lifted the whistle from its velvet bed. It was cold against his skin. He put it to his lips. He took a deep, shaky breath and blew. No sound came out. Not a whistle, not a hiss. Just the empty sound of his own breath passing through the silver tube. He blew again, harder. Nothing. It was broken. A useless piece of junk. Tears of frustration welled in his eyes. He was about to throw it across the room when he remembered Arthur's journal again. Dissonance, harmony, pure tone. It wasn't a normal whistle. It was one of Arthur's instruments. It must work on his rules. He thought about the hummingbird. He thought about the pulsing beacon his parents were following. Arthur's sounds were specific, pure. Maybe you didn't just blow into this whistle. Maybe you had to create the right kind of sound. He remembered his mother humming songs to him and Chloe at bedtime. She would hum one perfect, clear note to start a song. He closed his eyes, picturing his mother's face. He thought of the first note of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He puckered his lips and hummed the note, a clear, childish do. Then, while still humming the note, he put the whistle to his lips and blew gently, trying to push the hum through the instrument. This time it worked. A sound bloomed in the silent kitchen, a note so pure and clear it seemed to hang in the air like a crystal. It was a beautiful, piercingly high frequency that vibrated through the floor and up Liam's bones. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. It cut through the oppressive silence, a needle of pure sound. The effect on the house was immediate and violent. The lights in the kitchen flickered wildly. The refrigerator, which had been humming contentedly, let out a loud groan and fell silent. The rhythmic drip, drip, drip from the faucet suddenly stopped. From deep within the walls, there came a discordant, grinding sound, like massive gears slipping and gnashing against each other. It was a sound of pain. Liam snatched the whistle from his lips, his eyes wide with shock and a thrilling sense of power. He had hurt the house. He had found a weapon, A new noise started, a frantic, rhythmic scratching sound. It was coming from inside the pantry door at the far end of the kitchen. Asterisk scratch, scrabble, scratch. Asterisk, it was the sound of an animal, trapped and desperate to get out. Liam stared at the pantry door, his newfound courage evaporating. He had angered Arthur, and now Arthur was sending something else for him. He scrambled backward, clutching the whistle in his hand. His eyes locked on the rattling door. The scratching grew more frantic, more violent. The wood of the door splintered. A low, guttural growl echoed from within. This wasn't Arthur's quiet, psychological game. This was something else, something raw and feral. With a final, shattering crack, the pantry door burst open. But it was not a man who stumbled out. It was not a monster. It was Chloe. Her hair was a mess, her face smudged with dirt. Her little pink nightgown was torn at the hem. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were wide and strangely blank, her pupils dilated in the dim light. In her hand, she clutched a small, dark object, another one of Arthur's carved birds. She stared at Liam, but it was as if she were looking right through him. "Chloe!" Liam cried out, a wave of relief and confusion washing over him. He started to run to her, but stopped. Something was wrong. Chloe took a halting step forward, then another. She moved with a strange, stiff gait, like a puppet on strings. And as she walked, she began to hum. It was a low, monotonous, single-note drone. The same pure, steady hum his mother had heard coming from the bird. Chloe wasn't humming a song. She was humming the song of the house. Arthur hadn't just hidden her. He had been tuning her. The whistle in Liam's hand felt heavy, a terrible choice. If he blew it again, he would hurt the house. But what would the discordant sound do to Chloe, who was now so intimately connected to it? Would it hurt her too? Would it set her free? Or would it shatter something inside her? He looked at his sister, her eyes empty, her voice a hollow drone, a living instrument for a mad ghost. He had found a weapon, but the hostage was his own sister. The sight of his sister, a familiar vessel inhabited by an alien sound, paralyzed Liam. Her humming was the sonic equivalent of a blank stare, an erasure of the giggling, chattering Chloe he knew. The grinding, pained sounds from within the walls had ceased the moment he'd stopped blowing the whistle, replaced now by Chloe's monotonous, resonant hum. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. Arthur had changed the rules of the game again, presenting him with an impossible, agonizing choice. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's me. It's Liam." She didn't respond. She took another stiff, deliberate step toward him, the carved bird held tight in her small fist, her humming unwavering. She was an automaton, a flesh and blood extension of the house's will. Liam backed away, his small mind racing. The whistle was power, but it was a chaotic, unpredictable power. His parents, somewhere in the dark tunnels, were following a sound to find her. But she was here. They were in the wrong place. He had to help them. He had to help Chloe. But how? He glanced from his sister's vacant face to the silver whistle in his hand. He had made one sound, a high, clear note that had hurt the house. But what if the whistle could do more? The journal had talked about harmony and dissonance. His high note had been dissonance. What if he could create harmony? What if he could play a sound that didn't hurt the house but instead communicated with it? It was a crazy, childish idea, but it was the only one he had. He had to try to reach his sister, to break the hold Arthur's song had on her. He looked at the bird clutched in Chloe's hand. It was the source of the sound she was mimicking. He thought about the bird his mother had, and the whistle in his hand. They were all part of the same system. Maybe they could talk to each other. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his frantic heart. He needed to think like Arthur. Pure tone. Resonance. He couldn't just blow. He had to match a frequency. He had to match Chloe's hum. He closed his eyes and listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole body. He felt the low drone his sister was emitting, the way it seemed to make the air in the room vibrate. It was a lower note than the one he had hummed before. He tried to replicate it, a low, steady hum in his own throat. Felt strange, deep in his chest. He held the silver whistle to his lips. He pushed his own low hum through it, a fragile countermelody to his sister's drone. The result was instantaneous. A new note bloomed in the kitchen, but this one was different from the first. It wasn't piercing or painful. It was a deep, resonant tone, a cello's call to the first note's violin. It harmonized perfectly with Chloe's hum, blending with it, enriching it, creating a complex, beautiful, and deeply mournful chord that filled the room. The effect on Chloe was staggering. Her forward motion stopped. Her eyes, which had been blank and staring, blinked. A flicker of confusion, of awareness, crossed her face. Her monotonous hum faltered, breaking for a moment. A tiny, choked sob escaped her lips. "Liam?" she whispered, her voice faint, a ghost of her real self. The carved bird fell from her limp fingers, clattering onto the tile floor. "Chloe!" Liam cried, hope surging through him. He kept blowing into the whistle, holding the harmonizing note steady, afraid to stop. But the house did not like this new development. The beautiful, resonant chord was, to Arthur, perhaps an even greater violation than the dissonant shriek. Dissonance was just noise. Harmony created by an outside source was a challenge. It was a rival conductor trying to take over the orchestra. From the walls came a low, furious groan. The lights in the kitchen, which had steadied, began to flicker violently, stropping between blinding brightness and absolute darkness. The floor beneath their feet began to vibrate, a deep, angry tremor that rattled the pots and pans hanging from their racks. The secret panel leading to the back staircase, a door they hadn't even known was there, slid open with a loud thump, revealing a dark, yawning maw. A cold, foul wind blasted out from it, smelling of grave dirt and ozone. Arthur was asserting his control. Chloe cried out, a real cry this time, one of fear. The flicker of recognition in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by raw terror as the house itself seemed to turn on them. Liam knew he couldn't stay in the kitchen. It was Arthur's territory, and he was losing control of it. He had to get them somewhere safe, somewhere the house was weaker. He stopped blowing the whistle, and the harmonic chord died. The house's angry vibrations subsided slightly, though the lights continued to flicker erratically. He ran to Chloe and grabbed her hand. It was ice cold. "Come on!" he yelled over the groaning of the house. "We have to go." He pulled her, stumbling, out of the kitchen, away from the open passage and the angry heart of the house. He ran back toward the front of the manor, toward the grand foyer. It felt more neutral there, a space for arrivals and departures, less a part of Arthur's private, inner world. They reached the foyer, and the house's overt fury seemed to lessen. The lights steadied, the vibrations ceased. It was as if Arthur's influence was strongest in the working parts of the house, the kitchen, the passages, but weaker in the formal public spaces. Liam and Chloe collapsed at the bottom of the grand staircase, huddled together. Chloe was crying now, real tears, burying her face in her brother's shoulder. She was herself again for now, but she was terrified. Liam clutched the whistle. He had a weapon and he had a sister to protect. But he was just a little boy, and the house was vast and powerful. He looked up the grand staircase, toward his parents' room. That had been their original goal. Safety, a locked door. But the door to the hidden passage in the parlor was still closed, trapping his parents. He was on his own. His gaze fell on the front door. The way out. Escape. Detective Harding's words came back to him. Don't leave the property. But the police couldn't help them. The only thing that mattered was getting Chloe away from Arthur. He stood up, pulling Chloe with him. "We're leaving," he said, his voice a tiny echo of his mother's earlier resolve. He dragged her to the massive oak front door. He reached up and fumbled with the locks. There was a modern deadbolt, which he managed to turn with some effort. But below it was the original heavy iron latch and bolt mechanism. He stood on his toes, straining, but he couldn't get enough leverage to lift the heavy iron bar. They were trapped. A soft, melodic voice spoke from the top of the stairs. That door hasn't been the true way out for a very long time. Liam and Chloe froze, their blood turning to ice. They looked up. Standing on the landing, bathed in the pale moonlight from the hall window, was Arthur. He was no longer a silhouette in the shadows. He was there, solid and real, his long, pale face a mask of sorrowful disappointment. He looked like a father who had found his children misbehaving. "I gave you a gift," Arthur said, his resonant voice filling the foyer. He looked at Chloe. "I offered you a chance to be part of the music, to be eternal. But you," his dark, weary eyes shifted to Liam, "you prefer noise. You prefer chaos. You are just like all the others." He started to descend the stairs, his steps making no sound on the old wood. He didn't hurry. He moved with an unearthly grace, a landlord inspecting his property. "Give me the whistle, boy," Arthur said, his voice still soft, but with an undercurrent of cold command. "It does not belong to you. You do not understand how to use it." Liam stood his ground, pushing Chloe behind him, a tiny knight facing a dragon. He raised the silver whistle to his lips. "Stay back," he squeaked. Arthur smiled, a sad, pitying expression. "That little toy? I have let you play with it. But the game is over now. The house is awake, and it is hungry." He continued his slow, inexorable descent. Liam knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the whistle wouldn't work on Arthur himself. It worked on the house, and Arthur was its master. Any sound he made would only anger the house further, and Arthur would be unharmed. He was out of options, trapped between a locked door and a descending ghost. Just as Arthur reached the third-to-last step, a new sound cut through the silence. A loud, metallic bang from the direction of the parlor, followed by a splintering crack. Arthur stopped, his head tilting, his attention diverted. Asterisk bang. Crack. Asterisk. Someone was trying to break the door down. From the inside, a man's voice, raw and furious, roared from behind the wall. "Get away from my kids." Then, it was his father's voice. Hope, sharp and brilliant, exploded in Liam's chest. His parents were free. The fight wasn't over. The sound of his father's roar was a physical force, a shockwave of pure, paternal fury that blasted through the supernatural dread in the foyer. For Liam, it was the cavalry charge in the final reel, the promise that he was no longer alone. Inside the wall, the world had been a narrow, terrifying tube of darkness and echoes. Ben and Elara, following the stronger house song, had found themselves in a passage that grew progressively colder and narrower, the stone walls pressing in on them. They were deep under the central spine of the manor when the pulsing beacon they were following, Chloe's sound, had abruptly vanished. In its place, they heard the faint, piercing shriek of Liam's whistle. Panic, cold and absolute, had seized Ben. "He's got Liam," he'd gasped, turning, ready to charge blindly back the way they came. But Elara, holding the bird, had heard something else. The shriek had been followed by a new, complex chord, the harmony of the whistle and Chloe's hum. And then, the house itself had woken up, its angry vibrations shaking the very stones around them. There in the kitchen, Elara had realized, her mind making a desperate leap of logic. Liam found something. He's fighting back. They had scrambled back through the oppressive dark, their progress agonizingly slow. The rectangle of light from the parlor door was gone. The house had sealed them in. It was then they'd heard it. Arthur's calm, melodic voice, followed by Liam's tiny, defiant cry. Their children were cornered. Reason had evaporated from Ben's mind, replaced by a primal, explosive rage. He was no longer a pragmatist or a victim. He was a father whose cubs were threatened. He abandoned the search for a hidden mechanism and turned his fury on the wall itself, the dark, ancient planking that separated his world from his family's. He found a loose rock on the passage floor, a heavy, jagged piece of foundation stone, and began to hammer it against the wood. "Ben, don't!" Elara had screamed, afraid the collapsing structure would bring the whole passage down on them. But he was beyond hearing. He slammed the rock again and again into the same spot, the wood groaning, then cracking, then splintering. He was a berserker, driven by the sounds of his children's terror on the other side. Now, a jagged hole appeared in the floral wallpaper of the parlor. A spray of plaster dust and splintered lath exploded into the room. Ben's face, pale and grim with dirt and fury, appeared in the opening. A moment later, he heaved his shoulders through, tearing the hole wider, and stumbled into the room, a wild animal breaking free from a cage. Elara was right behind him, scrambling through the raw, splintered wound in the wall. Arthur, poised on the stairs, turned his full attention to the newcomers. His expression of sorrowful disappointment didn't change. He simply observed this new, violent intrusion, this new blast of noise. "The brute force of the living," he said, his voice resonating with a strange, sad clarity. So predictable, so clumsy. Ben didn't hesitate. He charged out of the parlor and into the foyer, his eyes locked on the figure on the stairs. He was a force of pure momentum. "Get away from them," he bellowed. He launched himself up the first few steps, his intention clear. He was going to tear Arthur limb from limb, ghost or no ghost. But it was like charging at a reflection in the water. Just as Ben reached him, Arthur took a single, calm step backward, onto the next tread up, and the house itself intervened. The grand staircase, the pride of Blackwood Manor, twisted. It was not a subtle shift. The solid, century-old oak groaned, not with age, but with effort. The step Ben was on buckled beneath him, throwing him off balance. The steps before him warped and flowed like thick molasses, the edges curling upwards, creating an impassable, undulating wave of wood. The elegant balusters of the railing stretched and bent, twisting into gnarled, claw-like shapes that reached for him. The very air grew thick and heavy, as if the house were flexing its muscles. Ben stumbled back, landing hard on the foyer floor, staring in disbelief at the monstrous transformation. He had come to fight a man, but he was facing an opponent made of timber and plaster and rage. "You see," Arthur said, his voice emanating from his perch atop the now surreal staircase. He stood untouched, the waves of warping wood parting around him. "You cannot fight the house. You are merely blood and bone. It is wood and stone and memory. You seek to harm me, but you only harm yourselves, smashing your fists against the walls of your own prison." Elara ran to Ben's side, helping him up, pulling him back toward the children. The family was a tight, terrified knot in the center of the foyer, a tiny island in a sea of architectural malice. "What do we do?" Ben gasped, his eyes wild. The pragmatist had died in the passage. The man standing now had no framework for this reality. Elara's mind was a whirlwind. Arthur was right. Brute force was useless. They were outmatched. But Liam had found a way. The whistle, harmony and dissonance. They weren't fighting a ghost. They were fighting a musician. They had to change the song. "Liam, the whistle!" she yelled. Liam, who had been frozen in terror and awe, raised the silver whistle to his lips. He didn't know what note to play. Dissonance to anger it? Harmony to calm it? Arthur's eyes narrowed. Ah, the little noisemaker. Clever toy. But every instrument has its limits. He raised one long-fingered hand, not at the family, but toward the ceiling of the foyer. The magnificent crystal chandelier, a cascade of glittering light, began to swing, slowly at first, then with increasing violence. With a sound of tortured metal, one of the chains snapped. The chandelier tilted precariously, its hundreds of crystal pendants chiming a discordant, frantic alarm. It was going to fall directly on top of them. "Move!" Elara screamed. She grabbed Liam's hand, Ben grabbed Chloe, and they scattered, scrambling away from the center of the room just as the chandelier broke free with a final, agonized screech of metal. It plummeted to the floor, exploding in a starburst of shattered crystal and twisted brass. The sound was deafening. The foyer was plunged into near darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight from the fanlight over the door. In the ringing silence that followed, Arthur's voice was calm, almost gentle. "The house does not wish for you to leave," he said, "and it is growing impatient with these games. The girl, Chloe, it is time for her to join the choir. The heart is ready for her." He began to descend the now straightening staircase. The wood untwisted, the balusters returning to their elegant forms, the house smoothing its features after its brief, violent outburst. It was toying with them, showing them the utter futility of resistance. "The library!" Elara shouted, her voice a raw command. Now! It was the only place that felt like a possible sanctuary. It was a room of knowledge, of secrets. It was where they had found the first clues. It was their only hope. Ben, his mind snapping back into focus, needed no further prompting. He scooped up Chloe, and Elara pulled Liam along as they fled the foyer, leaving the glittering wreckage of the chandelier behind them. They sprinted down the hall and burst into the two-story library, slamming the heavy oak doors shut behind them. Ben threw the heavy brass bolt, a gesture that they all knew was utterly meaningless against their foe. They were safe for a moment, the four of them, together, panting in the dusty, book-scented dark. Elara fumbled for a lamp, and a pool of warm, golden light filled the space, revealing the towering walls of silent, watching books. Outside the doors, there was silence. No footsteps, no rattling of the knob. Arthur wasn't trying to break in. He didn't need to. "He's letting us hide," Ben said, his voice a ragged whisper. "He's enjoying this. We need a plan," Elara said, her eyes scanning the shelves, searching for. She didn't know what. Another book? Another clue? "He's too powerful here. He controls everything." "Not everything," Liam said, his voice small but clear. He held up the silver whistle. "He doesn't control this." As he spoke, Chloe, who had been silent and trembling in Ben's arms, began to hum again. It was the same low, monotonous drone as before. Her eyes were beginning to glaze over. Arthur was reasserting his influence, calling her back to him even through the walls. "He's tuning her again," Elara cried in horror. "Give me the whistle," she said to Liam. She put it to her lips, her mind racing. What sound could they make? What was the opposite of Arthur's song? His music was about order, permanence, a single, eternal, unchanging chord. It was about absorbing life into a static, perfect whole. The opposite of that wasn't just noise. It was change, growth, life, a symphony, not a single note. Her eyes fell upon the local history book, still lying open on a reading table. The story of Arthur, the story of Eleanor. He was reenacting his past, trying to correct a perceived failure. But what if they introduced a new piece, something his rigid, obsessive tune couldn't account for? A floorboard creaked in the corner of the room, near the fireplace. The shadows there seemed to deepen, to coalesce. Arthur didn't need the door. He was seeping in through the cracks. "He's coming," Ben said, positioning himself between his family and the gathering darkness. "There's no song for a family," Elara whispered, a wild, desperate idea taking root. "His music is for one voice, the house, a single instrument." She looked at Ben, at Liam, at Chloe, who was fading before her eyes. "He doesn't understand this." She put the whistle to her lips, but didn't blow. She looked at her family, a conductor addressing her small, terrified orchestra. "We have to sing," she said. "Sing." Ben's voice was a ragged gasp of disbelief, the word torn from him. "Elara, he's a ghost, a monster. We're not going to defeat him with a sing-along." "You heard the journal, Ben," she insisted, her voice tight with a desperate, feverish certainty. The shadows in the corner were coalescing, taking on a taller, more defined shape. A coldness was radiating from them, a palpable drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the autumn night outside. "He wants a single, perfect, eternal voice. He can't understand a chorus. He can't process the chaos of a family. His song is about solitude. Ours is about being together. It's the only weapon we have that he can't comprehend." Chloe let out a low moan, her humming growing louder, deeper. The vacant look in her eyes intensified. She was slipping away, the house pulling her under like a tide. That was all the convincing Ben needed. He looked from his fading daughter to the terrifying, solidifying darkness in the corner, and the last vestiges of his rational world crumbled to dust. "What do we sing?" he asked, his voice now grimly resolved. "The first song he heard us use against him," Elara said, looking at her son. "The one you hummed, Liam. Twinkle, twinkle." Liam nodded, his small face a mask of fierce determination. He understood. This was his battlefield as much as theirs. The shadow in the corner had a form now. It was Arthur, his pale face and dark hair stark against the swirling blackness that clung to him like a cloak. He was not fully solid, more like a three-dimensional projection made of smoke and spite. He watched them, a look of profound disappointment on his face, as if their frantic emotionalism was a deep personal failure. "Such noise," his voice echoed, not from his mouth, but from all around them, a disembodied sound that seeped from the books and the wood, the final, pointless thrashing of frightened animals. Elara ignored him. She met Liam's eyes, then Ben's. She raised the silver whistle to her lips. She took a breath that felt like drawing fire into her lungs and blew the first clear, pure note of the melody. "See." The note hung in the air, a tiny silver bell ringing in defiance of the encroaching dark. Arthur flinched. Not a physical recoil, but a flicker in his form, a momentary disruption, as if the note were static interfering with his signal. Elara played the next note. C. Then G, G, the simple, hopeful melody of a child's lullaby weaving through the oppressive atmosphere of the library. As she played, Liam lifted his chin and began to sing, his voice small and reedy but clear and true. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." The house reacted instantly. A wave of force, cold and malevolent, slammed out from Arthur's form. A row of heavy leather-bound books on the shelf behind them shot out as if fired from a cannon, flying past their heads and smashing against the opposite wall. Ben flinched but held his ground. He pulled Chloe tighter against him and, his voice rough and painfully off-key, joined his son. "How I wonder what you are." His voice, so imperfect, so human, was like adding sand to Arthur's finely tuned machine. A low, grinding sound came from the fireplace, and the embers within flared, casting a hellish red light across the room. The shadows on the walls stretched and writhed, clawing at the edges of the lamplight. "It is a repulsive sound," Arthur hissed, his form wavering, his smoky edges swirling faster. "An insult to the silence." Elara's fingers felt numb on the whistle, the metal so cold it burned. But she pushed on, her breath steady, her eyes locked on her family. She saw the change in Chloe. The girl's head was now moving from side to side, a slow, agonized motion. Her humming was still there, but it was fighting with the words of the song, which were trying to bubble up from her memory. "Up, up, above," Chloe stammered, her voice a strange, discordant duet of her own small whisper and the house's deep drone. "That's it, sweetheart. Sing with us," Elara urged, her heart soaring. They were reaching her. They were pulling her back, up above the world so high. The three of them sang together now, their voices a messy, beautiful, flawed chorus. Elara's whistle provided the pure, melodic spine, while their voices wrapped around it, a testament to their chaotic, loving bond. Arthur roared, a sound of pure fury that was not a human voice but the shriek of stressed timber and shattering glass. The library became a vortex. Books rained down from the upper shelves. The heavy reading table levitated a foot off the ground and slammed back down with a deafening crack. The lamp flickered wildly, threatening to plunge them into the roiling darkness. Arthur's form solidified further, lunging toward them, his face no longer sad but contorted in a mask of rage. "I will have my silence," he shrieked, his voice finally seeming to come from his own throat. Ben shoved Elara and the children behind him, bracing himself for an impact that he knew would tear him apart. But he kept singing, shouting the words now, a defiant battle cry. Asterisk, like a diamond in the sky. Asterisk. At that final, high note, Elara poured every last ounce of her breath, her love, her fear, into the whistle. The note that emerged was impossibly pure, impossibly loud. It harmonized with the ragged, triumphant voices of her husband and son. And at that exact moment, Chloe, with a final, shuddering gasp, sang the line with them, her own voice breaking free from the house's drone completely. Asterisk, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Asterisk. The four distinct voices, one instrument and three human, combined into a single complex chord. It was not the sterile perfection of Arthur's song, but something far more powerful. It was the sound of a family. A wave of brilliant, warm, golden light exploded from them, from the whistle, from their very bodies. It was not a destructive force, but a wave of pure, unadulterated life. It slammed into Arthur. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and disbelief. The light wasn't burning him, it was erasing him. His form, which had become so solid, dissolved into a chaotic swirl of black smoke. The shadows in the room recoiled, snapping back to the corners as if yanked on a leash. The books fell to the floor. The table settled. The fire in the hearth died down to a gentle flicker. The smoky remnants of Arthur were sucked backward, pulled with incredible force toward the very structure of the house, funneled into a single knot of darkness above the fireplace before vanishing into the wall with a final, whisper-faint sigh. And then silence. A true silence. Not the oppressive, watchful quiet of before, but a peaceful, empty silence. The house felt dormant, neutral. The family stood panting in the wreck of the library, huddled together in the warm glow of the single, steady lamp. The whistle fell from Elara's lips. Chloe, fully herself again, was sobbing in Ben's arms, clinging to him for dear life. Liam, his face streaked with tears, buried himself in his mother's side. They had done it. They had faced the monster in his lair and, with the most unlikely of weapons, they had won. Is he gone? Ben whispered, his eyes scanning the room, still braced for another attack. I don't think he can be gone, Elara said, her voice trembling with exhaustion. He is the house, but we beat him back. We drove him deep, deep down. She looked around the ruined library, at her terrified, beautiful family. We found a way to fight him. For a long moment, they just held each other. A tiny, triumphant island of four in the vast, quiet manor. They had survived the night. They had rescued Chloe. They had found their voice. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, cold reality began to set in. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. They were still trapped in the house. Arthur was not destroyed, merely defeated. He was sleeping, perhaps, or wounded, but he was still there, woven into the very fabric of their home. And he would be back. He had their scent now. He knew what they were, and he would learn from his mistakes. Their song had worked this time, but Arthur Blackwood was a patient, obsessive artist. Next time, he would be ready for the noise. He would compose a counter-melody. The lullaby's final note faded, leaving a silence in the ruined library that was deeper and more profound than any they had yet experienced. It was the silence of a held breath, of a fever that has broken. Chloe was herself, her small body racked with sobs, but her eyes clear and present. Ben held her, his own tears tracing paths through the grime on his face. Liam, ever the stoic soldier, simply leaned his entire weight against his mother, his small hand clutching the silver whistle as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. They had won. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, the triumphant relief began to curdle into a cold, dawning dread. Elara walked to the heavy oak doors and tried the handle. Locked, bolted from the inside by their own hands. Ben set Chloe down and slid the bolt back with a loud thunk. He turned the handle. Nothing happened. He pulled, then threw his shoulder against it. The door, which had swung open so easily before, was now as solid and unmoving as the wall it was set in. A new wave of cold washed over Elara. She ran to the tall library windows, tugging at the sash. It was immovable, as if it had been welded shut. "He's sealed us in," Ben said, his voice flat with exhaustion and disbelief. "We're still trapped." The victory felt hollow now, a brief reprieve in a battle that was far from over. Arthur was not destroyed. He was wounded, driven back into the deepest recesses of the house, but he was still the master of the domain. They had found a weapon, but he had simply changed the locks. "What do we do now?" Ben asked, the question hanging in the dusty air. Wait for him to come back? To think of some new, worse horror? Elara looked at her family, at the terror still lingering in her children's eyes. Waiting was not an option. Fighting back with another song felt like a temporary solution, a way to win skirmishes but never the war. Arthur would adapt. He would learn their music and find a way to twist it, to turn it back on them. They couldn't win by fighting his game. They had to end it. "He wants a voice," Elara said, thinking aloud, her mind racing through the fragments of Arthur's journal. A single, pure voice to harmonize with the house. He failed with his niece, Eleanor. He failed with Chloe. Her gaze fell upon the open book, on the story of the man who had turned his home into an instrument of eternal solitude. "There's only one way to end this," she said softly. "I have to give him one." Ben stared at her, his face a mask of horror. "What are you saying?" "Elara, no. You can't mean." "I'm not going to let him take me," she clarified, her voice hardening with resolve. "I'm going to face him, not in a room he controls, but in the place it all comes from. The heart of the house." She looked at Ben, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "We can't fight the house, Ben. I have to join it. I have to become a part of the song, a note he can't ever remove." It was an insane, desperate plan, born of a logic that belonged to this house of whispers and ghosts. But in her soul, Elara knew it was the only path to a true victory. The goodbye was a tear-choked, frantic affair in the shattered library. Ben's protests gave way to a grim acceptance. He would protect the children. That would be his war. Hers lay in the darkness, in the arteries of the house. She kissed Liam and Chloe, a fierce, desperate kiss that promised a dawn she wasn't sure she would see. She took the small wooden bird and the brass key. Liam pressed the silver whistle into her hand. Their 3 gifts, their 3 weapons. With one last look at her family, a portrait of love and fear she burned into her memory, Elara turned and walked to the wound in the wall, the hole Ben had torn. She slipped back into the suffocating darkness of the passages. This time, the journey was different. She was no longer an intruder. The song of her family had changed her, attuned her. She could feel the house now, not just hear it. She felt its sluggish, wounded anger, a deep, resonant thrum of resentment. She felt Arthur's consciousness, a pinprick of furious, concentrated thought deep within the maze. He was waiting for her. She didn't need the bird to listen or the map to see. She followed the house's current, letting it pull her deeper, past the junction, down sloping tunnels that led far beneath the foundations. The air grew ancient, thick with the smell of petrified earth and deep, still water. She arrived in a vast, natural cavern. The air here was still and strangely warm. In the center of the cavern grew a colossal, twisted shape of black, stone-like wood. It was the taproot of some prehistoric tree, a knot of ancient power that was the source of the entire house's resonance. This was the heart, and Arthur was there. His form was no longer a smoky projection. He was woven into the great root, his pale face and hands emerging from the dark wood as if he were a part of it, a living carving. His eyes, deep and sad, fixed on her as she entered the chamber. "So, the little conductor has come to the stage." His voice resonated from the root itself. "Have you brought another nursery rhyme to deafen me with? It will not work again. I am one with the heart now. Your noise cannot touch me here." "I didn't come to make noise, Arthur," Elara said, her voice steady, echoing in the vast, quiet space. She held up the silver whistle. But instead of playing the chaotic, emotional notes of her family's song, She closed her eyes and listened. She listened to the deep, pure hum of the chamber, the house's foundational note. She found it in herself, and with a clear, steady breath, she played that single perfect tone back at him. The effect was profound. Arthur's form flickered. He looked at her not with rage, but with stunned confusion. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him in his own language. "You understand?" he whispered, a sound like rustling leaves. "I understand that you're lonely," she said, her voice filled with a pity that was more powerful than any anger. "And you've spent more than a century trying to compose a masterpiece with a single broken instrument. You don't need another voice, Arthur. You need a listener." She took a step closer to the great root. "You tried to make Chloe a part of your song. You wanted to absorb her, but you can't absorb me, because I'm not fighting you. I'm joining you." She pressed her palm flat against the cold, hard surface of the ancient root. She closed her eyes and did not sing. She did not play. She simply was. She let the house's deep hum flow into her, and in return, she pushed her own life force, her own resonant frequency, her own chaotic, loving, maternal soul into the heartwood. She did not try to overpower the house's song. She harmonized with it, a living, breathing, permanent grace note added to the eternal chord. She wrote herself into the very foundation of his reality. "What are you doing?" Arthur cried, a new panic in his voice. He could feel her, a presence woven into the house's core that he could not attack without attacking the house itself. She had become a part of his prison and his sanctuary. "I'm giving the house what it's always needed," she whispered. "A memory, a protector, a heart that beats." A brilliant, gentle light emanated from her hand, flowing like water into the dark wood of the root. Arthur's form, his face a mask of agonizing comprehension, began to dissolve. He was not being destroyed, but subsumed. He was a solitary note being resolved into a greater, more complex chord. His consciousness, his anger, his loneliness, it all flowed back into the root, fading from a roar to a whisper, to a final, deep, silent vibration. His face vanished from the wood. The heart of the house was still. Arthur was gone, and he was everywhere. When Elara returned to the library, pulling herself through the hole in the wall, the sun was rising. The light streaming through the now unstuck windows was warm and golden. Ben and the children were asleep, huddled together on a sofa, a portrait of exhausted survival. The heavy oak doors stood slightly ajar. They were free. They stayed. They could have left. The house would have let them. But leaving felt like an amputation. Elara was now part of it, and they were part of her. Life returned to a fragile, strange normality. They repaired the library. They replaced the chandelier. Chloe laughed again, and Liam put the whistle away in a box of treasured things. But the house was never just a house again. It was quiet, but it was never silent. In the still of the night, Elara would stand in the foyer, her hand resting on the cool plaster of the wall, and she would listen. She could feel the slow, steady pulse of the heart deep beneath the floor. She could feel the lingering trace of Arthur's sorrow, a deep, bass note of memory that no longer held any threat. It was just a part of the song now, a story the house told to itself. She had saved her family. She had defeated the monster. But in doing so, she had taken on his mantle. She had become the new caretaker, the guardian of the silence, the house's living memory. She was home, and she was haunted, and she was at last at peace.